Thank you, Uncle Wally, for that acknowledgement. Welcome this morning. I think it's really important that we recognise that role and that custodianship responsibility that we have for each other and for country. And that, for me, is the foundation of the discussions that have happened on this journey in the First Nations Advisory Group. Before I get into going through this, it has been a fairly quick process for the SWIOID review, and there's a lot of information to get your heads around. For those that are in the stakeholder advisory group, they can attest to that as well, I'm sure. It's for First Nations communities, I think it's even more challenging because there's actually a position that needs to be put, and it's the one that's on the screen at the moment. So often, First Nations communities are seen as the advisors in spaces and places. That's not who we are. As a Dharawal Yuin person, off country here today, but with strong respect for my connection to place, it's really hard. It's really hard to just have that advisory role and be positioned in that space where you have this obligation to country. And within that, you need to understand that country is the determiner of everything. And if you're not in relationship with those spaces, you can't be you. You're actually losing your identity. And we need to start from that place if we're thinking about what this is all about from a First Nations perspective. I would actually go as far to say that we all have this obligation. We all have this obligation. But you can only have that obligation when you're in true relationship with that place and understand those rules that country gives you. So we need to start there. We've been through a process with this group, recognising the length of the Murrumbidgee, the Upper Murrumbidgee, which everyone has of interest here today, and that cuts across several groups within this space, and therefore there's complexity in relationship around that, and country reacts differently in different places. I'm not here to speak for country. I'm here to articulate a position on behalf of those custodians of this country and of country in the Upper Murrumbidgee. So I want to be clear about that before I start, because I do take this quite seriously culturally, and it's a really important thing to recognise. When we look at this, the four puzzles that you see on this screen there: country, authority, the water, restoration, all themes that everybody is quite aware of when it comes to looking at the Upper Murrumbidgee, but there's missing pieces. And those missing pieces for the First Nations group are that authority that sits around custodianship, that relationship with place. And that was the main focus of the journey that we had as we worked through our consultation. But moving into it, so building on that picture now, the unfinished picture. So we got country, community, we got a river, but the authority and that capacity within these communities is challenged. It's always challenged. And this needs to be a central focus of how we move forward in these spaces. We recognise the river networks as a living cultural landscape, and it's one that we have deep relationship with. I say we, and I need to caveat that we. That's me talking as a First Nations person, but not specific to this country. We all have these obligations to our own country. I'm not here to speak on behalf of this country, but I will use the royal we because some of these themes are universal. So we have this relationship. We need to fill in those puzzle pieces that are missing there. And that story and those puzzle pieces can only come from country. They can't come from policy. They have to come from relationship. We need to understand the spaces and places that we're in. If we don't understand that, we cannot do a better job. And that obligation that sits with country can't be exercised. So what were we looking at here? The river network. It's one living system. We can't break this thing down. It's one living system. We need to recognize that. All waterways are connected. You can't isolate one bit without impacting another. The fact that the Murrumbidgee is suffering, but so is the Tumut, because it's getting too much water. And these are the stories that we're hearing and that was coming out in our advisory group. We need to make sure that we're treating these things holistically. We need to make sure that country, culture, and governance are all interlinked. We need to make sure that that decision-making process has the integrity of First Nations custodianship. It's not just an action that talks to making something better. It's actually an action that's about making everything that's in that place better and sustaining that into the future. Because that's what custodianship is about. It's not the here and now, it's beyond. It's thinking generations ahead. And this is the work that needs to happen. To do that, what came out of it is this shift in authority. Really having First Nations community central to that authority. Recognising that if we're not part of that governance model, it's going to fail. There's tens of thousands of years of history and understanding of place, and we've heard that today, that has to be understood and implemented into these areas. But it also takes us back to that recognition of disconnection as well. The trauma that sits with that. The lack of authority that says, well, you can't be exercising your cultural authority because it doesn't fit within these other spaces. It doesn't fit within the governance models or government models that we have to respond to. But in saying that, you're saying to Aboriginal people, we don't really care about your custodianship, effectively. These things need to be considered in what you do, because healthy country means healthy people. And that's for everyone. And I heard somebody talking about the water supply that they drink every day. If the water's not healthy, if the environment's not healthy, none of us are healthy. This has been practiced for tens of thousands of years on this place. And that needs to be recognised. It's not about the advice that you add later. This is fundamentally embedded into what we should be doing. And this is what the First Nations group's calling for. But they're not doing that in a way that means we're banging the table and demanding we have to control absolutely everything. There was recognition, and we talk about the 3 zones of decision making. When it comes to our culture, when it comes to that relationship with place and those significant cultural areas, that is purely up to First Nations people to say, this is the way we want to be in relationship with this place. This is the way we want it managed. We talked about a zone 2, which is the shared governance model. And this is becoming more embedded because of Closing the Gap initiatives, and there's other government policies that are starting to sit around this. But shared decision making and shared governance should be really that, shared. It shouldn't be, okay, you can have a say in this, but we can ignore that if we want. No. We have a say in it, and there's equal power that sits in this space. So that's zone 2. Zone 3 was recognition that, let me go back, because overlaying all this is that notion that if we don't have this authority, you're actually saying that we shouldn't exist in many ways, because you're saying, well, that cultural custodianship role that you have has no effect, or it has no authority in this space, and therefore we can ignore that if we want. That's not the way First Nations people see themselves in relationship with country, because they have to have that relationship to be who they are. So we need that underpins these zones. When it comes to zone 3, it's advice only. So we've already had the discussion about shared decision making. We go to and the community in that co-governance model and that shared responsibility. So, well, we understand these are the things that are going to happen in this space naturally. We don't need to know every single detail, but here's the principles that you can go ahead and just do stuff, and just let us know what you're doing, so we can exercise our relationship with these places. But it also then goes back to zone 2, because if you step outside of that, we need to go back to the co-governance discussion to make sure that we're all on the same ground. We need to have that accountability within this deed review, because without it, it'll just be ignored. But the other thing this does, is create a reporting framework, and a really interesting one. So one of the actions there's about 30 recommendations in our report. So it's a fairly weighty report, and I would recommend for any of you to go and read it, because there's a lot of substance to that report, and a lot of thinking, deep thinking, that's gone into how we can activate these things. The recommendations really focus on how this collaborative framework of decision making, elevating that authority in those spaces, and it's been done in a way that's recognised country as the authority, but also recognise we're working in an environment now that is heavily guarded, dictated, controlled by other entities as well. But we need to change that paradigm, because when First Nations people need to be elevated back into that position of custodianship, away from just being advisors. Other things we talked about, the fire. So the fire keeps culture alive. So we looked at these 3 themes around cultural responsibility, if you like. And one we refer to as the fire being a metaphor for living practice on country. It's not cultural burning, that's part of it. It's actually about what's this cultural relationship, and what's the substance and that fire within that keeps you pushing within what you do on country. To achieve that relationship and that deep relationship and activate the culture in those spaces, we needed access to the land. That access for First Nations communities has been removed. We need to get back in those spaces, because you can't practice culture if you're not on country. So we need to get that access. We need to elevate the teaching, that sharing of knowledge, the deep understanding of place that has always been there culturally, that sustained generation after generation of First Nations people in a place. We need to create the spaces for those things to happen. We also need to bring back, elevate, recognise, remove from the sleep the stories that are still there but have been buried because of the systems that they're in. We need support around that. We need to engage in those spaces. The hands. And we see some of this, and it's good to see some of the guys from Ginderry Trust here. Did I get that one right? Ginderra? I always get it wrong. Ginderry Trust here today. The Ranger programs, looking at the hands is really about the practical aspects of this. So one, you can have the spiritual connection, making sure that you're building the systems of knowledge transfer, but you also need to have the practical aspects of this. And moving back into that healthy country space, establishing ranger programs and building that relationship practically in there, managing and monitoring those spaces, recording what's there in terms of the cultural practice. And I heard, it was mentioned earlier about Aboriginal waterway assessments. These are practical approaches around what can be taken to, one, restore that connection back into those countries, but also practically enable people to do work that's culturally rewarding, that's spiritually rewarding, and continues. Making sure the budget's there to enable these things. Look at enterprise development. How do we sustain these communities? Because through the right investment, you can actually have much bigger impact. And SWIOID provides an opportunity for that. The life. So this is really about thinking about that healthy environment. And this is why, one of the activators for why we're here. We want a living ecosystem. We don't want a dead ecosystem. And here's an opportunity to do that. Creating that living waterway program, thinking about the species that are within that, the native species, the flora and fauna, and the whole ecosystem as one, and supporting that, and having First Nations people actually providing that and being in there and supporting that, renewing their health as well as the health of the river. Looking at those the interconnected waterways. So as I said, it's not just one. We have to think about the whole system here and what that means for how the whole environment functions, and supporting that through the monitoring and creating evidence. But the evidence shouldn't just be scientific. There has to be traditional ecological knowledge also incorporated in that. What are the values of the First Nations communities in those spaces, and how does that feed into how we want to see the monitoring occur? Cultural water. So this is a big one. In the recommendations, we've called for cultural water to be acknowledged for nation groups across the Upper Murrumbidgee. There's been a request to look at 6 gigalitres of water allocated into to those First Nations groups. That really is it, one, recognising that the water is important culturally. Also, there's a whole modern movement around cultural water for First Nations communities, so it's activating that aspect of it. Also looks at how does that create economic opportunities, spiritual opportunities to communities that are in relationship with those rivers. Let's get this right. It's because it's actually beyond just talking about the Murrumbidgee as this slither of water that runs through country. It actually has all this multifaceted life that needs to be celebrated, that First Nations communities along that river have known for tens of thousands of years, and that needs to be elevated. We talked about custodianship needing infrastructure in terms of buildings, but infrastructure in terms of the authority that sits with that, and also looking at what that means in terms of the capacity for individuals in that. It has to be a living deed, and we heard Wendy talk earlier, and you might see a bit of replication here. Annual report, but a 5-year review. The annual report's an interesting one because the way it's been framed within the advisory group, it's not an annual report to government. It's an annual report to country. How have we changed what we're doing to support country? How are we elevating that custodianship responsibility of First Nations communities in what we're saying we're doing. Not what we're telling government, oh yeah, we did this, we ticked the box, no, this is about that relationship. A 5-year review. Also, we've called for a triggered review of the whole deed if First Nations communities aren't happy with progress. What's it all about? It's restored country. Not just restored river, we're talking restored country. But we're talking restored people at the same time. It's elevating that relationship that First Nations people have with those places. Country authority, capacity, constant review creates a system where First Nations communities can actually be elevated beyond the role of just advisory into one of custodianship.